Picture this. Powering our world with batteries. Batteries made using metals pulled from the deep, deep ocean floor.
Sounds pretty futuristic, right?
Totally. But, this race for these battery metals, it's very real.
It absolutely is.
And today we're diving into something fascinating looking back at a 44-year-old experiment. And it's giving us some really vital clues about the long-term environmental effects of, potentially mining down there.
Exactly. We're looking at a study that just revisited a deep-sea mining experiment from way back in 1979.
1979. Wow.
Yeah, in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, the CCZ, out in the Pacific.
Okay, the CCZ. Why is that area so important?
Well, it's just packed with these things called manganese nodules.
Manganese nodules?
Right. Think of them as like mineral lumps that have built up over millions of years.
Right.
And they've got high amounts of nickel, cobalt.
Stuff we need for batteries.
Precisely. The metal's essential for the whole green energy transition.
Okay, let's unpack that 1979 experiment a bit more. So scientists actually went down and simulated mining. What was the point?
The main idea was really twofold. First, to just investigate the basic processes, like how would this even work?
Makes sense.
And second, crucially, to get some kind of preliminary read on the potential environmental impacts. What might happen.
And they picked the CCZ because they already knew it was rich in these nodules.
Exactly. It was already flagged as a prime spot. So this experiment was like an early probe.
And why does looking back now matter so much?
Because it gives us this incredibly rare long-term view. You just don't usually get data stretching over 4 decades for this kind of thing.
44 years, that's almost unheard of in ecological studies, isn't it?
It really is. It's a unique window.
So they go back to the site after all this time. What's the first thing they see? What jumps out?
Well, the most immediate thing, and maybe the most startling,
Yeah?
was that the physical tracks. The marks made by the mining gear back in 79,
Yeah.
they are still clearly visible, right there on the seabed.
Still, after 44 years.
Still.
Yeah.
One of the study authors, Dr. Adrian Glover, actually said they look almost as if they were made yesterday.
Wow. Almost as if they were made yesterday. That paints a really stark picture, doesn't it?
It really does.
What does that tell us about the deep sea environment itself?
It just hammers home how incredibly slow everything is down there. Biological processes, recovery, it all happens on a vastly different timescale.
Because it's so cold, high pressure, not much food.
Exactly. All those factors mean that the ecosystem's ability to bounce back from, well, any disturbance is just incredibly slow, protracted.
So those visible tracks are like a constant reminder of how long physical damage can last.
A very striking visual reminder, yes. It really emphasizes the duration of the impact we need to think about.
But I read it wasn't all doom and gloom. Weren't there some signs of life starting to come back?
Yes, that's a really important nuance here. So while the physical scars are, very much there, the study did find evidence that some smaller mobile organisms are starting to recolonize the disturbed area.
Okay, smaller mobile ones. Like what?
A specific example they highlighted was the return of xenophyophores.
Xenophyophores. Quite a name. What are they?
They're these fascinating single-celled organisms. They're kind of like giant amoebas. They're actually quite common in the CCZ and play a role in this.
Okay, so seeing them come back is encouraging.
It is encouraging, yes. It's actually the first solid evidence we have of any biological recovery in a major potential mining area in the Pacific.
The first evidence, that seems significant.
It is. Dr. Glover specifically pointed out that, quote, animal life has actually started to recolonize the mined area.
So a glimmer of hope, maybe? That these ecosystems have some resilience.
A glimmer, yes. It suggests resilience is possible, but we're still figuring out how much and what kind. It's definitely a more complex picture than just total devastation.
More nuanced picture. But you mentioned smaller mobile organisms. What about other types of life?
And that's the other side of the coin. The recovery they saw is definitely uneven.
How so?
While these smaller creatures are showing up again, the larger stationary ones, things that are actually attached to the sea floor.
Like corals or sponges?
Yeah.
Deep sea versions.
Exactly like that. Things like deep sea coral sponges.
Yeah.
They are still notably absent from those disturbed tracks.
Still absent after 44 years.
Still absent.
Why the difference? Are they just taking even longer, or is something else going on?
Well, the thinking is that these larger sessile, meaning fixed-in-place organisms, are probably just much more sensitive to that initial physical disruption.
Because they can't just move away and come back.
Precisely. Their habitat is physically removed or destroyed. They're stuck there. Mobile creatures might be able to move back in, maybe find food in the disturbed sediment.
But the fixed ones need the original conditions, maybe. Stable ground.
They likely need much longer periods of stability to reestablish, yes.
Yeah.
Their whole life strategy is different, seemingly more vulnerable to this kind of impact.
Okay, so this study gives us this amazing long-term snapshot, but it's from one relatively small experiment, right?
That's absolutely key. Tiny, really, compared to what commercial operations might look like.
How tiny are we talking? How does it compare to potential industrial mining?
Well, think about it. The 1979 experiment disturbed a very small patch. Commercial mining licenses could cover areas from thousands to maybe tens of thousands of square kilometers.
Thousands, wow.
And the whole CCZ itself, it covers about 6 million square kilometers. The scale difference is just immense.
So trying to extrapolate to sort of scale up the findings from this one spot to predict the impact over vast areas,
Yeah.
that's a huge challenge.
It's a fundamental challenge. Dr. Glover himself stressed how difficult, maybe even impossible it is to just scale up these local ecological effects and predict what happens at the ecosystem level or globally.
Because the systems are so interconnected and we just don't know enough.
Exactly. The complexity, the interconnectedness, the sheer size. It introduces a massive amount of uncertainty. It really complicates doing proper environmental impact assessments.
Makes sense. It forces you towards modeling and risk assessment, which have their own issues.
They do. They have inherent limitations and uncertainties that policymakers really need to wrestle with.
Okay, another big worry you always hear about with seabed mining is sediment plumes.
Ah, yes. The clouds of kicked up sediment.
Right. The concern is they could drift and clog the gills of filter feeders or smother organisms away from the actual mining site. What did this long-term look show about that?
Interestingly, on that specific point, the study found relatively little evidence of long-term negative impacts on the overall number of animals present in the immediate area.
So maybe slightly better news on that front than some feared?
Somewhat more optimistic, perhaps, for the immediate vicinity studied, but, and it's a big but, this is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. It doesn't necessarily tell us about effects further away or on specific types of animals that might be really sensitive to cloudy water.
Precisely. The full consequences of sediment plumes, especially how far they travel and their effect on, say, filter feeders or larvae in the water column, that's still very much an active area of research and concern.
Okay. So we're kind of left in this really tricky spot, aren't we?
We really are.
On one hand, there's this massive push for these metals, the nickel, the cobalt, stuff we genuinely seem to need for batteries, for solar panels, for the green transition.
A very real and increasing demand, yes.
But on the other hand, we've got this evidence of potentially very long-lasting damage to an environment that is, well, incredibly fragile and we barely understand.
That's the core tension, isn't it? This study really throws it into sharp relief. The need for resources for a sustainable energy future versus the potential environmental cost of getting those resources from the deep sea.
And the effects are clearly long-term, but maybe not uniformly devastating. It's complex.
It's complex, and the full picture is still emerging. This 44-year data point really sharpens the debate, particularly around things like the precautionary principle.
Meaning, should we act with extreme caution given the uncertainties?
Exactly. Some argue this longevity of impact means we need extreme caution, maybe even a pause or moratorium on large-scale mining until we know much more. Others might point to those small signs of recovery as suggesting that perhaps very carefully managed extraction could be feasible. It's a huge debate.
So wrapping this up, 44 years later, the physical scars are still there. That's a powerful takeaway.
Undeniably, it shows the sheer persistence of physical disturbance down there.
And while some smaller life is returning, which is, helpful,
A positive sign, yes.
the larger fixed creatures are still missing. And figuring out what all this means for potential industrial-scale mining, that remains a massive challenge.
A huge challenge with enormous uncertainty.
Now, for you listening, especially those of you perhaps aiming for the UPSC, this deep dive really serves as a perfect case study, doesn't it? It shows the complex balancing act involved in resource management, development, and environmental sustainability.
Absolutely. Understanding these long-term consequences, especially in poorly understood ecosystems like the deep sea, is just critical for anyone involved in policy and governance. It touches on technology, environment, economics, international law.
All crucial areas. It really pushes you to think about those tough questions, like what is our responsibility to these remote, barely known ecosystems as we pursue resources for ostensibly a greener future on land?
How do you weigh that urgent need against potentially irreversible damage? There are no easy answers.
Definitely not. It's something critical to consider.
Indeed.
Well, for more deep dives into critical topics like this one, please do keep tuning in.
We hope you find these discussions valuable.
And if you did find this analysis useful, perhaps for your UPSC prep or just for understanding the world a bit better, please do like, subscribe, and maybe share your own thoughts or questions in the comments below. We do try to read them.
We do. And if you want to dig into the original study details we discussed today, the source report we base this on can be found over at the Daily Galaxy.
Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.